Welcome to the Story Mechanics. Today we're going to explore how literature really works, not just what stories say, but how they say it. Imagine a medieval tower at night, where a father sits in darkness with his starving children. Their bellies ache, and their eyes plead for food that never comes. This is the haunting scene Dante Alighieri gives us in Inferno Canto 33, as Count Ugolino and his sons starve together in the Tower of Hunger. It is an image that stays with readers. A tragic father holding dying children, and a betrayal so cruel it seems to freeze the soul. Why is this one of the most disturbing moments in all of literature? What is this strange scene? A nobleman gnawing on the skull of his enemy while recounting his own horror. Tell us about Dante's view of justice and suffering. In this episode, we'll take a closer look at Count Ugolino's true story, the grim details of the tower, and the children's death, the shocking and oddly ambiguous idea of cannibalism in the text, and why Dante condemns Ugolino among the worst traitors. Along the way, we'll see how Dante's poetry creates deep sympathy for Ugolino's plight, even as it upholds a harsh moral order. By the end, perhaps we'll understand why this episode still haunts readers more than 7 centuries after it was written. Let's begin with who Count Ugolino really was in history. Count Ugolino della Gherardesca, circa 1214 to 1289, was a powerful Pisan nobleman, deeply entangled in the turbulent politics of late 13th century Italy. Pisa was a maritime republic torn by factional conflict between the Guelphs, papal supporters, and Ghibellines, imperial supporters. Ugolino's family was Ghibelline, but Ugolino himself made pragmatic alliances. At one point he even married into a Guelph family to secure alliances for Pisa, but such political maneuvering earned him many enemies. According to medieval chroniclers and Dante, Ugolino twice betrayed Pisa by ceding its castles or allying with outside powers for personal gain. In 1285, while serving as head of Pisa, Ugolino agreed to hand over important Pisan fortresses to rival cities like Florence and Lucca. He did this as a desperate measure to appease factions that threatened Pisa's safety. That one act of surrender, whether it was treason or not is debated, would become the most famous accusation against him in Dante's poem. Before that, Ugolino had actually sought peace with Pisa's enemies after losing a naval battle to Genoa in 1284. In return, he was made chief magistrate podestà of Pisa, sharing power with his young Guelph grandson, Nino Visconti. Their arrangement later collapsed, and by 1287, Ugolino was coordinating with old Ghibelline allies, including Archbishop Ruggieri degli Ubaldini of Pisa. This alliance backfired. When Ugolino quarreled with his own grandson Nino and drove Nino's party out of the city, Ruggieri, the archbishop, turned on Ugolino. In 1288, Ugolino was lured back into Pisa under friendly terms, but was suddenly arrested by Ruggieri. The archbishop accused him of treachery and rebellion, setting the crowd against him. Ugolino was hauled off to a prison tower, the famous Torre della Muda, later called the Tower of Hunger, accompanied by 2 of his sons, Gaddo and Uguccione, and 2 grandsons, named Anselmuccio and Brigata. Some accounts mention also an illegitimate son who died during these events. Pope Nicholas IV later wrote that the keys of the tower were thrown into the Arno River so that no one could release them, condemning the entire group to starvation. So historically, Ugolino was a shrewd political figure who switched sides several times, which caused outrage among Pisa's Ghibellines. It was exactly these acts of betrayal, abandoning Pisa's castles to enemies and changing allegiances, that qualified him as a traitor in Dante's moral scheme. As the Dante World's commentary notes, Count Ugolino earned his place in Antenora, the realm of political traitors, for a series of betrayals against Pisa and her leadership. In other words, Dante and his contemporaries saw Ugolino as a traitor to his own country, regardless of whether he thought he was serving Pisa's best interests. Now if we step back for a moment, notice how complex this is. Ugolino did betray Pisa's party, but it was the Archbishop Ruggieri who betrayed him. Political alliances in 13th century Italy were notoriously unstable, and Dante's readers in Florence knew this era well. They would have expected that treacherous end. But Dante doesn't simply list those political betrayals. Instead, he plunges straight into the personal horror. Ugolino recounts dying in that tower with his hungry children. And this is where the text reveals something deeper. According to Dante's Inferno and the chronicler Villani, Ugolino and his family were immured in a tower with no hope of escape. For months, they received only scraps. Then finally their captors locked them up completely. Villani writes that the key was tossed into the river and the door nailed shut, meaning the prisoners would starve unless someone relented. Dante portrays the horror of those final days in harrowing detail. we hear that Ugolino's 2 young sons and 2 grandsons fell asleep and awoke sobbing from the hunger in their bellies. As Dante's pilgrim narrator Virgil describes it, "My dear sons offered themselves to their father. Oh, dear father, you would lessen our suffering if you fed on us. It was you who gave us flesh. Here, take it and eat from us." This moment is one of the most chilling. The children, innocent and already dying, plead that their father may survive by devouring their bodies. But the text makes clear that Ugolino refuses. He composed himself and would not horrify his children. Instead, he quietly endures their agony as one by one they die over several days. By the 4th day, his eldest son Gaddo collapses and dies at his feet. On the 5th and 6th days, the remaining sons and grandsons follow. Dante tells us Ugolino went blind from hunger and groped about among their corpses, calling each by name. It is an utterly unendurable scene, and Dante's narration moves us through it slowly, day by day. Finally, at the moment when the last child succumbs, something breaks in Ugolino. In Inferno 33.79 he says, in English translation, "Then fasting had more power than grief." This phrase has haunted readers for centuries, as commentator Alexander Athiman writes, because it is so stark and paradoxical. In other words, Ugolino says that by that point the cold gnawing emptiness of hunger overcame even his grief for the children. And this is precisely where the deep ambiguity of the episode emerges. Some readers believe Ugolino means that after his children died, hunger overcame his grief, and he lapsed into animalistic rage. Others interpret the line more sympathetically. He simply means that intense starvation made it impossible to cry or feel pain anymore. In plain terms, did fasting have more power than grief? Is he confessing to cannibalism, or just saying he could no longer cry? Asciman calls this verse the Historis Vegas Cannibal, since it invites the reader to wonder if Ugolino finally did eat human flesh. No direct evidence in Dante's text says Ugolino actually ate his children. In the lines we quoted above, the father tells Dante he held back tears so as to spare his kids. After they died, he says this line and simply resumes gnawing on Ruggieri's head. Some interpret fasting had more power as meaning hunger overcame sorrow and I devoured them, while others think it means I was so weak that even grief had to give in to starvation. Dante himself never shows us Ugolino actually biting any of his children. What we do see is him weeping, praying to God, and finally out of despair, he bites his own hands. In any case, the line is deliberately cryptic, and here Dante's technique is subtle. This is where things get interesting. By leaving the ultimate act unspecified, Dante forces us to sit with the horror and compassion at once. Ugolino confesses to the terrible crime of treachery, yet we instantly feel pity for him, as a grieving father. When he says fasting had more power than grief, it's a shock note, and as Achaemen notes, it has been interpreted variously. Dante thereby implicates the reader. He's daring us to decide, based on our own conscience, what we think happened. The Inferno does not resolve this ambiguity. Instead, as soon as Ugolino says that line, Dante's narrative abruptly shifts back to the present. Ugolino savagely attacked Archbishop Ruggieri's skull. He gnaws on Ruggieri's head like a dog, tearing out brain matter and licking it off the victim's hair. This grisly image is literal poetic justice. Ruggieri starved them, so now he's Ugolino's eternal meal. But even in this savage act, there's a larger meaning. It's a symbolic contrapasso, counterpoise of punishment. Dante believed that in hell, sinners must suffer a punishment that reflects their sin. Ruggieri betrayed Ugolino to death, so now Ugolino gnaws at his traitor's brains. Dante's text underlines this as a form of divine justice. The ambiguity around cannibalism is so famous that it deserves its own mention. As Dante's poem was copied and discussed in medieval classrooms, commentators still debated Ugolino's guilt. In modern times, this ambiguity is often pointed out as one of Dante's most powerful techniques. Consider Aciman's words again. After quoting the line, he comments that some believe it means he continued to starve, whereas others contend that Ugolino ate his dead children. In other words, Dante's economy of detail creates a harrowing question that readers wrestle with. What does this reveal about Dante's art? It shows how deeply he understood human psychology. Up until then, Ugolino's speech is all about the kid's innocence and Ugolino's own suffering. When the key moment comes, he doesn't admit outright to cannibalism. Rather, he utters a line that might signal it. Dante never lets Ugolino exonerate himself. He never says, "I did not eat them." On the contrary, Ugolino's final line leaves open the shadow of that terrible deed. And yet immediately after, Dante abruptly shifts the focus. We see him gnawing on Ruggieri. It's as if Ugolino's own fate will be defined not by whether he ate his children, but by his relentless hatred for Ruggieri. This subtlety adds to the emotional power. It means the story doesn't settle as a simple crime and punishment story. Instead, we the audience are haunted by the image of those children and Ugolino's silence about their fate. As one scholar puts it, Dante cleverly does not attempt to exonerate Ugolino of the crime, political treachery, for which he is condemned, even as he defames his enemy and elicits our compassion by recounting the brutality of his own death. In plain terms, Dante shows us brutal justice, but also the innocent victims of that justice. The result is devastating, but enough suspense. We must emphasize, in Dante's structure, Ugolino is in hell not for cannibalism, but for betrayal. He's in a circle of traitors called Antenora for treachery against country. Dante carefully makes this point. When Ugolino resumes gnawing on Ruggieri, the narrator notes that Dante has placed him among the traitors, meaning his damnation is for treason, not for eating children. Indeed, after Ugolino finishes telling his story, Dante the poet breaks from Ugolino's perspective and even interjects his own voice. He exclaims indignantly that Pisa, Ugolino's city, has marred the beauty of its people by this act of cruelty. This is Dante the pilgrim stepping aside to voice his outrage. It's unusual. Rarely does Dante openly chastise a whole city in Inferno. He does so here to underline a moral. Ugolino's children were innocent victims, and punishing them was unjust, however guilty Ugolino might be. So why exactly is Ugolino damned among traitors in the lowest circle? Dante's moral universe is rigid. Betraying one's lord, country, kin, or benefactors is the worst of crimes, since it corrupts the very bonds of society. Ugolino's betrayal was political. He had, by his own admissions and by common rumor, betrayed Pisa to foreign enemies, handing them her fortresses. To medieval sensibilities, this was nearly as heinous as betraying a friend. By placing Ugolino in Antenora, Dante is telling us, this is how betrayers must pay. In fact, Dante also places Ruggieri in the same frozen pool, face to face with Ugolino, one biting the other's skull. The two are bound together eternally. Dante's narrator explains that in this icy pool, the souls pack so close, one's head hooded the other's, and Ugolino gnaws on Ruggieri's brain like mastiffs, a vision drawn straight from Dante's lines. This literal, one eating the other image dramatizes ultimate justice. The betrayer becomes victim. Let's step back. Ugolino, as traitor in Dante's eyes. The Dante World's commentary summarizes it well. Ugolino is condemned to eternal damnation because of political treason. We should note that Dante, the character, has also been betrayed by Ugolino in Florence's internal politics, so he is not entirely sympathetic to Ugolino's guilt. Dante the Pilgrim even calls Ugolino infamous at one point, but the poem then immediately pivots to humanize Ugolino. Even while hearing the story of treachery and starvation, Dante and Virgil weep. This leads to the episode's emotional force. The Cliff's Notes essay observes something profound. Ugolino is condemned as a traitor, yet Dante presents him as someone betrayed. Notice how Dante shows him, locked in ice with Ruggieri. He is not ranting about castles or politics, but asking, "If you have no pity, I will pray for vengeance on Pisa for me." The focus is on his grief. Dante's genius is in this contrast. At the end of hell proper, a traitor is portrayed not with arrogant self-justification, but in parental anguish. His sorrow and love for his children shine through the horror of his revenge. This is not a coincidence. Dante often gives poetic justice multiple layers. The law of retaliation here is that Ruggieri starved the children, so Ugolino is forced to become the savage feast for the man who killed his family. At the same time, Ugolino's narrative reveals the law of love. He loved those children so deeply that even after they die, His hatred of their murderer will never be satisfied. One critic eloquently sums it up. Ugolino hates violently because he loved his son so intensely. His hatred is so great because his love was infinite, and his grief is so desperate because nothing can assuage it. This extreme cycle of love and hate is the heart of the scene's power. It also highlights Dante's theme of infinite justice. Ugolino's vice was betrayal, but the contrapasso makes us feel the cruelty of betrayal turned back on its head. And yet Dante also reminds us of the innocence of the innocent. It is conspicuous that the starving children are not held guilty of anything. Dante's narrator even calls out the children as innocent and good, here rendered in translation as gentle boys and unsullied youth. This outburst coming from Dante's own voice suggests that the punishment of children outraged Dante's moral sensibility. At this point, we see the broader picture. What does this scene tell us about how Dante believed justice and guilt worked in human life? One lesson is that sin has far-reaching effects. Ugolino's crime was political, but its consequences were devastatingly personal and innocent. Dante punishes the crime, the politics, with ice, but he also exposes the cruelty of letting innocent children suffer. Dante's theology is that God's justice is perfectly just, that his contrapasso is not vengeance but truth. Ruggieri, who starved others, himself is eaten. Ugolino, who starved, in turn suffers eternally, and yet is allowed this awful victory of revenge. We might conclude that Dante is showing us that evil, Ruggieri's betrayal and cruelty, receives its due, but not without cost. And what about Ugolino himself? Here's the most subtle part. Dante preserves Ugolino's guilt. He is damned, but overwhelms it with pathos. The narrative structure invites us to feel sorrow for him, despite his sin. The scene says, even traitors are still human, with loves and sorrows. This is part of Dante's message throughout Inferno. Everyone suffers in hell, and each story reveals something about humanity. Dante reminds us that no sinner is a one-dimensional monster. Each has a story of love, weakness, or pain. It also reflects Dante's personal experiences. He himself was exiled from Florence and felt betrayed by old allies. Dante the poet sympathizes with exiles and victims of politics. He uses Ugolino's story to criticize corrupt politics and to argue that justice cannot excuse cruelty. Literature works here by collapsing personal and political realms. We see that when politics is unjust, it creates suffering that cries out for divine justice. Now, if we step back even further, for us as readers, the scene raises timeless questions. What does it mean to be guilty of a crime when one has also been wronged? Can atrocious acts, even implied ones like cannibalism, ever be separated from the context of unbearable suffering? Dante doesn't answer them outright, but his poetry forces us to grapple. We might imagine Dante the pilgrim finishing Ugolino's story and thinking, who is the greater sinner, the betrayer, or the victim's hungry hand? He even says we can decide for ourselves if Ruggieri did him an injustice. That line from Dante's text is a kind of plot twist. Dante, the character, says essentially, you judge now, who is worse? This conversation with the reader is exactly why this canto endures. It's not that Dante endorses cannibalism, far from it, but that he uses it as a literary mirror reflecting the darkest capacities of the human heart under suffering. After all this, why do so many readers still find themselves haunted by Ugolino's story? Part of it is simple empathy. Anyone who is a parent can barely imagine a child suffering, much less dying of hunger. When Dante forces us to see that image and hear the children's offer to save themselves by giving their father their flesh, it cuts to something primal in us. But more than shock, there is beauty and complexity in Dante's storytelling that transcends its medieval context. He does not betray us with easy answers. As the Paris Review essay puts it, in spite of everything, we inevitably pity Ugolino. He has laid his soul bare, not pleading innocence, but telling us of heartbreak. We're left with a paradox. A traitor engenders our pity. A scene of cannibalism makes us reflect on compassion. Dante uses every detail, the locked tower, the offer of flesh, the final line, to engage our imagination and emotion. That's how literature works. It surprises us, makes us uncomfortable, and then makes us think. Even in a story set in a distant past, Dante is teaching us about loyalty, cruelty, and the bonds between parents and children. These themes never lose their force. So if 700 years later we still shudder at this canto, it's because Dante was wrestling with universal human questions. We ask, is it justice to damn a man who suffered so? Should love and mercy ever temper justice?